Park Ranger John says that this next story is the only time in his career that he has ever questioned whether this job is the right one for him. This call was your typical lost child call. It was about a 4-year-old who had wandered away from her family's campsite and been missing for about 2 hours. And the parents were completely beside themselves, absolutely despondent. And they said the typical thing that parents do. It's not like her to wander off. She's so good at staying close. She's never done anything like this before. So they assure the parents they're going to find her, and they spread out in their standard search formation. Now, John is paired up with his good friend Carl. And as the two of them are hiking out, they're just holding conversation, which can sound kind of callous. But as John explains, A, this is kind of the norm for them, and B, you have to learn to desensitize a little bit in order to do this job. So they're out searching. They've been out for a good 2 hours, and they come out into this valley. They stop and look at each other, and there's this feeling almost like the depressurizing of a plane. And John said his ears even popped. And he had this feeling like he had just dropped 10 feet. And he starts to ask Carl if he felt that too. But before Carl can answer, they hear the loudest sound they've ever heard in their entire lives. It's like a freight train passing right next to them. But it's coming from everywhere. It's coming from all directions, even above and below them. Now Carl tries to scream something to John, but John can't hear anything other than this roar. And they're looking around to try to find the source of it, and neither one of them can see anything. So they're both totally freaked out. And John says that the only thing he could think of was a landslide. But if it were a landslide, it would have hit him by now. And the sound goes on, and they're standing right next to each other, trying to yell things at each other, but neither one of them can hear anything. And then just as quickly as it started, it stopped. Like somebody threw a switch and it was over. And they both stand there for a minute, perfectly still. And slowly, the normal forest sounds came back. Now, Carl asked John what the F just happened. And John doesn't have any idea, so he just kind of shrugs his shoulders. Then John gets on his radio and asks everybody else if they just heard the end of the world. And even though they're all within shouting distance of each other, nobody else heard anything. So John and Carl just kind of shrug it off and keep walking. Now, my question as a regular human being is, how do you go through that kind of experience and just shrug it off? But John says that when your job is to be out in the deep forest every day, that you can't really afford to get spooked. You just have to learn to shrug these things off and keep going to do your job. And for that, I tip my cap to those fearless search and rescue personnel. But back to the story. They go on for about another hour and they check on the radio and nobody has found any trace of the young girl. And it's getting dark outside, and usually they don't search in the dark. But because they don't have any kind of a lead on her at all, John and Carl decide to keep going. And as they're searching on, they're staying close to one another, and they're calling out for the girl every couple of minutes. And John remembers thinking to himself that, oh God, they hope they can find her. Because the woods can be scary enough to a kid in the daylight, but at night, it's a whole nother nightmare. But they're not seeing any signs of her. They're not getting any responses. So about midnight, John and Carl decide to pack it up and head back to the rendezvous point. But about halfway back, Carl stops and shines his flashlight into a group of dead trees off to the right of them. And John asks, "Did you hear something?" And Carl says, "Shh, just listen." And they can both hear what sounds like a child crying. So they both call the girl's name, hoping to get some kind of a response. But all they can hear is this faint crying. So they start moving through the woods in that direction, kind of going around all of these dead trees, calling her name over and over again. And as they get closer, John says he starts getting this weird feeling in his gut. And he asks Carl, and Carl says he feels the same thing, but neither one of them can figure out what the problem is. So they stop where they are, and they call the girl's name again, and just then they figure out what the problem is. The crying sound that they're hearing is like somebody's playing a recording on a loop. It's the same kind of hiccup cry and then wail and then sobbing over and over again. Exactly the same every time. So without saying a word, they both take off running. And John says he's never ever lost his composure like that before. But they both knew something wasn't right and they did not want to be out in those woods to find out what it is. And as for the little girl, they never found a trace of her.